On a crisp February morning in the heart of Everstead, a town where traditions ran deep and secrets were whispered behind lace curtains, the air buzzed with the anticipation of Valentine's Day. The quaint streets, lined with old brick buildings and cozy cafes, carried the scent of fresh roses and melted chocolate. But beneath the surface of romantic gestures and promises of forever, a storm was brewing, one that would leave the town reeling in horror. Kian Mercer was the kind of man people envied. At 27, he had it all: a successful family business, a bright future, and the admiration of almost everyone in Everstead. More importantly, he was set to marry Ayla Dawson, the daughter of a well-respected judge. Their wedding was just weeks away, a grand affair that had the entire town talking. Ayla, elegant and graceful, carried herself with an air of quiet confidence, but behind her soft smiles lay an insecurity that she never voiced. Then there was Mira Langston, a striking woman with a sharp mind and a history with Kian that few knew about. Their past was a tangle of passion and recklessness, a love that had burned too brightly and then flickered out at least. That's what Ayla had been led to believe. But love, especially the kind that leaves scars, never truly dies. As the town celebrated Valentine's Day with candlelit dinners and whispered sweet nothings, Kian found himself entangled in a moment of weakness. The past came rushing back when he met Mira at a secluded bar on the outskirts of town. One drink led to another, old emotions reignited, and by the time the night faded into early morning, they were tangled in the sheets of a motel room far from Everstead's prying eyes. But secrets have a way of unraveling, and when Ayla received an anonymous message, an image of Kian and Mira together, it was as if the ground had been ripped from under her. A betrayal on the eve of their wedding. Rage, heartbreak, and humiliation collided inside her. But it wasn't just Ayla who knew the truth. The next morning, Kian's lifeless body was found in the very same motel room where he had spent the night. A deep wound carved into his chest, his once confident eyes frozen in shock. The room was eerily silent, save for the faint scent of roses wilting in a vase on the nightstand. But Everstead had a way of pulling people back, and when she returned, it wasn't long before their paths crossed again. The old chemistry was still there, simmering beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to ignite. Then there was Judge Peter Dawson, Ayla's father, a man who built his life on the foundation of justice and control. He had spent years molding Ayla into the woman she was, ensuring she never stepped out of line. But love, especially love tainted by betrayal, was unpredictable. He had watched Kian carefully, analyzing him the way he would a man on trial. And though he had given his blessing for their wedding, there was always a quiet wariness in his gaze. Now, with Kian dead in a motel room, his future erased in a single violent act, the town was left to wonder, who had been pushed too far? Was it Ayla, humiliated and betrayed just days before their wedding? Mira, the woman who had never stopped loving him, or perhaps even Judge Dawson, a man who valued honor above all else? One thing was certain. Everstead was about to uncover the dark truths that had been hiding behind the polished facade of its most admired couple. The Evergreen Motel sat on the outskirts of Everstead, a place most respectable townsfolk pretended not to notice. It wasn't the kind of place where love stories blossomed. It was where secrets were hidden. Room 206, its faded blue door slightly ajar, smelled of stale air, cheap cologne, and something else. Something metallic. The cleaning staff at the motel were used to messes, unmade beds, cigarette burns on the carpet, the occasional drunken guest passed out past checkout. But nothing prepared Rosa Martinez for what she saw that morning. She pushed the door open, the dim morning light spilling in through the gap in the heavy curtains. At first, she thought someone had just left in a hurry. Clothes were scattered, the sheets twisted. Then she saw the red pooling on the floor, seeping into the worn-out carpet like ink spilled from a broken pen. Her breath hitched. Kian Mercer lay sprawled across the bed, his once pristine white dress shirt stained dark with blood. His head was tilted to the side, eyes wide open, frozen in the last moment of shock. A deep wound carved through his chest, jagged and brutal, as if whoever had done it wasn't just trying to kill him, but punish him. Rosa stumbled back, pressing a trembling hand to her mouth. The cleaning cart tipped over behind her, sending bottles and towels crashing to the floor. The sound seemed to shatter the eerie silence, sending a jolt of terror through her. She turned and ran. By the time the first patrol car arrived, a small crowd had started gathering outside the motel. Everstead was a town where news traveled faster than the wind, and word of a dead man, a murdered man, spread like wildfire. Detective Callum Hayes stepped out of his car, already feeling the weight of the case before he even entered the room. He had seen a lot in his years: domestic disputes turned deadly, bar fights gone too far. But this felt personal. The room was suffocating with the thick scent of blood and regret. Hayes took it all in: the overturned chair, the empty whiskey glass on the nightstand, the deep gash that ended Kian Mercer's life. No signs of forced entry. No struggle, at least not an obvious one. Whoever did this, Kian had let them in. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a text from one of his officers at the station. Ayla Dawson just arrived with her father. She looks shaken, says she needs to talk. Hayes let out a slow breath, his eyes flicking back to Kian's lifeless body. He had a feeling this was just the beginning. Detective Callum Hayes stood at the doorway of room 206, his sharp eyes scanning every inch of the space. As the town awoke to the gruesome discovery, whispers spread like wildfire. Who had done it? Was it Ayla, the betrayed fiancée? Mira, the woman scorned? Or someone else, lurking in the shadows, who had seen an opportunity for revenge? In Everstead, love had turned into murder. And in the end, someone had decided that betrayal deserved the most permanent punishment of all. Kian Mercer had always been the golden boy of Everstead. Raised in a family that owned one of the largest real estate firms in town, he had wealth, charm, and an easy confidence that made people gravitate toward him. His parents, Grant and Eleanor Mercer, were well-known figures. His father, a shrewd businessman. His mother, the elegant socialite who ensured their name was synonymous with power and influence. But Kian wasn't just the privileged son of rich parents. He was ambitious, determined to carve out his own success rather than live in their shadow. To the people of Everstead, Kian and Ayla Dawson were the perfect match. Ayla, the daughter of Judge Peter Dawson, was refined, intelligent, and fiercely loyal. Her upbringing had been strict, molded by the expectations of her father, a man who believed in discipline and reputation above all else. Ayla had spent her entire life trying to meet those expectations, and with her upcoming wedding to Kian, it seemed she had done just that. They were Everstead's power couple, the kind of pair that parents pointed to as an example of love and stability. But what no one saw was the quiet turbulence beneath the surface. Ayla loved Kian, but she often felt like a supporting character in his life. He was the center of every room, every conversation, while she played the role of the perfect fiancée, smiling on cue, supporting his dreams, and silencing any doubts that crept into her mind. And then there was Mira Langston. Mira had always been different from the women Kian usually surrounded himself with. Where Ayla was composed and predictable, Mira was wild, unpredictable, and magnetic. Their relationship had been passionate and consuming, but also toxic. They had been on and off for years before Kian finally walked away, choosing the safer, more stable future with Ayla. But deep down, Mira had never truly let go. Her life had taken a different turn after Kian. She had moved away for a while, started a career in marketing, and tried to build a life outside of him. The air was thick with the coppery scent of blood, mingling with the cheap cologne Kian Mercer had likely put on the night before. Hayes had been in homicide for over a decade, and he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't a random attack. This was intimate, deliberate. Someone had wanted Kian dead, and they had made sure of it. He stepped further into the room, careful not to disturb anything. The sheets were twisted, the pillows slightly askew, but nothing suggested a violent struggle. The wound in Kian's chest was deep, clean. Whoever had done this had known exactly where to strike. Forensics arrived moments later, setting up their equipment. The lead technician, Mia Caldwell, crouched near the bed, her gloved hands steady as she examined the wound. "Single stab wound to the chest," she murmured. "No hesitation marks. This wasn't a frenzy. It was controlled." Hayes nodded. He had suspected as much. The murder weapon was nowhere to be seen, which meant the killer had taken it with them. He turned to his partner, Detective Jonah Reed, who had just finished speaking with the motel staff. "The night manager says Kian checked in alone around 10, Reed reported. "Nobody saw him leave, but a guest down the hall swears she heard voices around midnight arguing." Hayes exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. Male or female voices? She couldn't say for sure, but she heard a door slam not long after. That meant someone had been here with Kian, someone who had left him to bleed out alone. As crime scene techs dusted for prints and bagged evidence, Hayes walked outside, where Judge Peter Dawson and his daughter Ayla were waiting by the patrol car. Ayla's face was pale, her hands clenched into tight fists. The judge, ever the composed man, stood stiffly beside her, his jaw set. Hayes approached cautiously. "Ayla, I heard you wanted to talk." She lifted her head, her blue eyes glassy with unshed tears. "I got a text this morning," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It was a picture of Kian. With her. Hayes' gaze sharpened. "Who?" "Mira Langston," she said, bitterness creeping into her tone. "I knew he'd been with her last night." The detective exchanged a glance with Reed. That changed things. If Ayla had known about the affair just hours before Kian was killed, it gave her a motive. And if someone had sent her proof, then someone else had known about it too. "Where were you last night, Ayla?" Hayes asked carefully. Judge Dawson cut in before she could speak. "She was home. With me." His voice was firm, unwavering. "My daughter had no reason to harm Kian." Ayla swallowed hard but didn't argue. Hayes nodded, but he wasn't convinced. He turned back to Reed. "Find Mira Langston, now." As his partner moved to make the call, Hayes glanced back at the motel room. The crime scene had already started to tell its story. The question was, who was lying? Mira Langston sat in the dimly lit interrogation room, her arms folded tightly across her chest. Her dark curls were disheveled, her eyeliner smudged, and her lips pressed into a thin line. She had been called in the moment detectives uncovered her connection to Kian Mercer. Detective Hayes sat across from her, his fingers tapping lightly against the desk. "Tell me about last night, Mira." She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "We met up, that's it." "You expect me to believe that? A man turns up dead in a motel room you were last seen in and that's all you've got?" Mira's jaw clenched. "I didn't kill him." "But you were with him," Hayes pressed. "What time did you leave?" She hesitated. "Around midnight." Reed, standing by the door, spoke up. "That's interesting because a witness says they heard arguing around that time. What were you two fighting about?" Mira shifted uncomfortably. "He told me he wasn't leaving her." "So you left?" "Yes," she snapped. "I left, and when I did, he was alive." Hayes studied her face. She was angry, heartbroken, but was she lying? Meanwhile, at the Dawson estate, Ayla sat stiffly on the couch, her father's presence looming beside her. Her fingers were still curled into fists. "I got a text with a picture of him and Mira," she said, her voice hollow. "It came from a blocked number." "You confronted him?" Hayes asked. She nodded, eyes glistening. "I called him. He didn't deny it. He just kept saying it didn't mean anything." Her voice cracked. "I hung up. And then?" Ayla glanced at her father before responding. "I stayed home." Hayes didn't miss the slight hesitation. Judge Dawson's face was unreadable, but his grip on the armrest tightened ever so slightly. "Did you know about the affair before last night?" Hayes asked him directly. The judge's expression darkened. "I suspected, but I didn't tell my daughter until I was certain." "Certain how?" Dawson's jaw clenched. "I hired a private investigator." Hayes raised an eyebrow. That was new information. "You have the report?" The judge nodded. "I'll get it for you." As he stepped away, Hayes turned back to Ayla. "Did you go to the motel last night?" Her eyes flashed with something: fear, anger, guilt. No, maybe she was telling the truth. Maybe she wasn't. Either way, the walls were beginning to close in on someone. Back at the lab, Mia Caldwell combed through the forensic results. The blood spatter pattern suggested that Kian had been sitting on the bed when he was stabbed, a single, precise strike. No hesitation. No struggle. Then came the prints. "Kian's prints are all over the room as expected," she told Hayes. "But there's another set on the whiskey glass." "Let me guess, Mira's?" Mia frowned. "No, it's Ayla Dawson's." Hayes leaned forward, his mind racing. "Ayla was there." Reed exhaled. She lied. As they processed the evidence, another officer walked in, holding a bagged phone. "Kian's call log," he said. "Last call? Judge Dawson." Hayes exchanged a look with Reed. This just got even more interesting. Hours later, in the dim interrogation room, Mira sat across from Hayes once again. This time her posture had changed. Less defiant, more uneasy. Hayes slid a folder across the table. You want to explain why Kian was wiring you money every month? Mira's face paled. It wasn't what you think. Try me. She hesitated, then sighed. It wasn't just an affair. She met his gaze. I was pregnant. Last year. Hayes's eyebrows lifted. Was? She swallowed. I lost the baby. Kian knew, but he kept sending money anyway. I think he felt guilty. And Ayla found out? Mira nodded. Not the pregnancy, just the affair. But if she had seen those bank statements, Reed stepped in. What about Judge Dawson? He was Kian's last call. Mira's expression darkened. Judge Dawson hated Kian. If he knew what Kian had done, he did know. Hayes interrupted. He pushed another paper toward her. A report from the private investigator. And I think he was done letting Kian ruin his daughter's life. The room fell silent. For the first time, Mira looked afraid. Detective Hayes stared across the interrogation table at Judge Dawson. The air in the room was suffocating, thick with unspoken truths. The once powerful man, who had spent decades upholding justice, now sat with his hands clasped tightly together, his knuckles white. His reputation was unraveling, thread by thread. You were the last person Kian called, Hayes said, his voice measured. What did he say? The judge exhaled slowly. He begged me to understand, he admitted. His voice was raw, stripped of its usual authority. He said he loved my daughter, that the affair was over, that he wanted to fix things. But you didn't believe him, Reed pressed. Dawson's jaw tightened. Why would I? He humiliated my family. So you went to the motel. The silence stretched. Then finally, the judge nodded. His gaze dropped to the table. Yes, Reed leaned forward. Did you kill him? The judge's breath hitched. His hands trembled slightly before he clenched them into fists. I didn't mean to, he whispered. I wanted him to admit what he'd done, to face me like a man. His eyes were distant now, lost in the memory. He wouldn't stop talking. Kept saying it was a mistake, that Ayla didn't need to know everything. And I saw red. His voice cracked. I grabbed the knife from the table. 1 second he was standing there, lying to my face. The next he was on the floor. He was on. A long pause filled the room. Did Ayla know? Hayes asked. The judge shook his head, tears brimming in his tired eyes. No, she suspected, but she didn't know. The confession was complete. The weight of it settled in the air, suffocating. Judge Dawson, the very symbol of justice, had become the man he once sentenced. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the benches, cameras flashed, and whispers ran through the crowd. Judge Dawson sat at the defense table looking smaller than ever. The prosecution painted him as a man driven by pride and anger, someone who had taken justice into his own hands. The defense argued temporary insanity, a moment of blind rage, not premeditated murder. But the evidence was clear. The jury delivered their verdict, guilty of voluntary manslaughter. The judge, once the highest authority in that very courtroom, now stood as a convict. The sentence, 15 years in prison. Ayla sobbed silently in the gallery. Mira sat stone-faced, her lips pressed into a thin line. The town of Ravenswood had just witnessed the fall of its most powerful man. The town of Ravenswood would never be the same. Ayla left for the city soon after the trial, unable to bear the whispers, the stares. Her father's crime had stained their name forever. Mira disappeared as well. Some said she moved states away, trying to start fresh. The courthouse, where Judge Dawson had once ruled with an iron fist, now stood as a haunting reminder of the scandal. His name was removed from every plaque, his legacy erased. People still talked about that Valentine's night, how a moment of anger destroyed a family, how secrets, once buried, had the power to ruin everything, and how love, twisted and broken, could turn deadly. What do you think about this tragic case? Was Judge Dawson a grieving father pushed too far, or was justice served? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more gripping true crime stories, because sometimes the truth is far darker than fiction.